So welcome everybody. I'm your guest speaker for the day. My name is Jeffrey Wilson. This is my third time speaking for the Historical Society here in Clermont County. I was here almost 1 year ago. I was here last April. And I talked about the East Fork work, so we'll talk a little bit about that today. But the reason I'm here today is to talk about my recent book called Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, the expanded edition, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I just wanted to say thanks for the invitation, Clermont County Historical Society. Appreciate the return invitation. So, how many people have ever read this book, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley? Couple people. Okay. So the book, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, was authored by two gentlemen from Chillicothe, Ohio, and was published by the Smithsonian Institution in 1848. It was the Smithsonian's very first publication. And so for the 175th anniversary of the publication of that book, I republished it as an expanded edition. And so the original book was about 350 pages. I added about 1,000 pages to that original book. So it's a multi-volume edition. So I'll get the commercial out of the way first if anybody is interested in this. Well, it's changing on my screen, but not up there. Let's see if I can. How about that? All right. So if anybody is really interested in this book, it is now out in 3 hardcover editions and managed to squeeze it into 2 paperback editions. If anybody is interested, that's the 2 paperback editions. The color hardcover is archival quality, highest quality paper kind of thing. The black and white paper edition is the budget edition for those that it's still quite expensive when you're publishing 1,300 pages of stuff. So, but that's the new book. For those that are interested, you can order it direct. It's print on demand from lulu.com, or you can go to serpentmoundbooks.com and it'll take you to a link to order it if you're interested.
Serpentmoundbooks.com.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
We need that book.
So the book, it was accepted for publication in June of 1847, and it was published in March 1848, but not released to the public until July. This is literally only about a year or so after the Smithsonian was founded. So they very quickly had this idea that they wanted to start publishing scientific stuff, and this was the first thing that they chose to publish. The 2 gentlemen that wrote it, Ephraim George Squire and Dr. Edwin Hamilton Davis, as I mentioned, they were from Chillicothe. They partnered together to write this book, and I say partnered in a very loose definition. What they did partner together was going around and digging up mounds in the Chillicothe area as part of their couple of year partnership. Squire was from New York, and he accepted the job to be the newspaper editor at the newspaper in Chillicothe. And so he moved to Chillicothe in 1845, and then within a couple of days, he met up with Davis, Dr. Edwin Hamilton Davis, who has already been sort of an expert on the mounds and the earthworks. He'd been really sort of excavating and mapping out mounds and earthworks since the 1830s. And so he'd been around for, working on that for about a decade. And when Squire came to town, then they started working together on that. And according to them, over the course of the next 2 years, they excavated more than 200 mounds. Now, that's also a loose sort of definition because they weren't out there with a shovel and a pick digging that stuff up themselves. What was happening was Davis was paying for a crew of people to go around and dig up the mounds. And, so the work is not really attributable to Squire and Davis directly. Now, the book is also filled with lots and lots of material that Squire basically appropriated from other people. And sometimes he gives credit to those other people, and sometimes he doesn't. And so we'll kind of talk about that as we go a little bit. Part of the goal of my reissuing this book was to identify what is all the original source material that Squire used to create his book. Who were the people that did the work? You know, who did the earthwork surveys? Who did the digging? Who, you know, put the artifacts back together that were broken? You know, all of that material so that those people could get proper credit after a couple hundred years of, you know, for what they had accomplished. So that's part of it. Part of the goal of working on this book was I actually started working on this book during the pandemic, and I was working on a book about Serpent Mound, which I'm still working on. That's my next project. I'm in the midst of that. And this book, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, published the first illustration of Serpent Mound, and the first published account written about Serpent Mound was really in this book that was sort of widespread. And so when I was working on my Serpent Mound book, one of the things that I was doing was Squire and Davis only wrote 5 paragraphs about Serpent Mound. That's it. And 2 of the paragraphs have really nothing to do with Serpent Mound. It's sort of Squire's comparison of Serpent Mound to stuff in the old world, which is all a bunch of nonsense. So there's really only 3 paragraphs, you know, about Serpent Mound. And so I kind of fact-checked what they had written. They made a couple of factual errors. But one of the things I noticed was that this is a very famous illustration of Serpent Mound. It's been reprinted hundreds and hundreds of times in the historical literature and the archaeological literature in particular. And I've not seen in any of those other sources where it's been reprinted that does not attribute this illustration to Squire and Davis. It's always attributed to Squire and Davis. The problem is that when you read the fine print right down at the bottom, it says it's a lithograph, and the artists were 2 guys by the name of Cerrone and Major. And I was like, wait, everybody says this is Squire and Davis, but it clearly states on the page, it's not by Squire and Davis, it's by Cerrone and Major. And so I wanted to find out more about how the Smithsonian, you know, selected artists to make these illustrations, and what does it mean to be a lithograph versus any other kind of illustration. And so I had to take a dive into what is printing technology in the 1840s, what does that look like, who are the artists that are doing these things, and so a lot of that material, you know, got into this analysis. And one of the things I learned was that the lithographers of that period of time, they had to create the illustration, but they were usually working off of a prior source illustration. And they would have to take like a stylus and scrape away a wax-covered stone tablet, and to create that illustration in mirror reverse from the original source illustration. And I'll show a couple of examples of this. But then they would put a kind of a weak acid on that, which would etch that illustration into the stone. They would wash all that off, they take all the wax off, and then they would use that etched into the stone tablet, coat it with ink, and stamp it on the paper. That's how these illustrations were done. And, you know, people are not Xerox machines. And so oftentimes if you go back to the original source illustrations and you compare them with what got printed, there are obvious differences between them, and I'll show you some of those things. And so part of what evolved into this project was, hey, let's look at all this original source material from all these different people that worked on the material that eventually wound up in this book. And let's compare what those people did versus what got printed, and let's see what all the differences are. And there are a lot, and so I can't cover everything in this talk, but we'll show, a handful of examples. So I just want to put out here that this was plate 35. It was titled The Serpent, Adams County, Ohio. And I decided to go on a hunt for the original source illustration. And, it's kind of like, after 175 years, what are the chances that original source illustration still exists somewhere? Well, there are probably about 20-some institutions around the United States that hold collections of papers of Ephraim George Squire. And I found the original source illustration in one of those collections at the Library of Congress. And so along my journey of going and checking out all these different original source collections of papers, one of the places that I went to was at the Western Reserve Historical Society up in Cleveland. They have a collection of papers of Squires, and amongst that collection of papers were draft lithographic prints that were being made by the artists for Squire to then edit. And so this is an edited version of what got printed later on. And you can see there's some red X marks on here, and you got a red 25 at the top. But the detail, the vivid detail in these additional or right off the block lithographs, are pretty amazing to see. And so this is an example of one of those. As Squire was editing the book, they sent him to New York City to work with the artists, Saroni and Major, and they were working, and they would make a print, and they would show it to him, and then he would look at it and say, oh, you spelled this word wrong, X, fix that. And then they'd have to go back and fix it, and then they would do another one. And so there's a couple of versions of that. I found there's actually a stack for every lithograph that's in the book. So here's another one. They got the number wrong at the top. Here they spelled steep without two E's. So he's got some editorial marks on there that they need to check, right? But the details of the lithograph are incredible to see, being the first ones right off the block, because they kind of wear out after a while. So you print 1,000 copies and it gets kind of worn down, right? Now, the original illustration that was used, this is it. Okay. This was in Squire's papers, and you'll notice that there's some detail differences, right? So Saroni and Major, kind of delineated the cliff with a lot of extra detail versus what is shown on Squire's original drawing. One of the things that I have seen in the archaeological literature over the past 150 years or so is that modern archaeologists are really critical of this because it doesn't really show the bends of Serpent Mound as we see it today. And so they said, they kind of got this wrong, it's back in the 1840s, what did they know, right? And so they're kind of critical of Squire and Davis. But what this shows is that Squire actually did delineate it very, very well. It's very close to what we see today in terms of these bends in the serpent and the spiral tail. And that just did not get translated by the lithographers, right? So what does that tell us about going back and looking at the original source documents versus using, these printed materials? Well, if you're an archaeologist, you ought to be going back to the original source materials to find those detailed differences and see what things really look like. One of the other things I found while I was at the Western Reserve Historical Society was Squire's original field notebooks. And, so they visited Serpent Mound in 1846, and then that while he was there, he made some sketch drawings. And so this is one of the sketch drawings that he made. So this is like one of the earliest drawings that's ever known to exist. And I was the first one to publish that in my book. So there's a couple of these in there. And again, there's even differences on Squier's drawing versus his sort of source drawing, right, that he gave to the lithographers. He did not include any details inside the oval here, right? But there is that detail here on his actual sketch drawing from when he visited. There is a stone altar that used to be in the center of that oval. And that's what is being delineated there, right? So that's what this little dot here is, and there's a cross-sectional line that they drew so that you can see it on here. And there's the oval and the center stone altar. Now, for those that are kind of unaware of the history of Serpent Mound, that stone altar lasted there until the 1980s. And then the Ohio Historical Society people got tired of cutting the grass around it, so they picked up the stones and walked it to both sides of the cliff and threw it over. And so I worked on a project in the 2000s to identify where all those stones were. And we, went and flagged them all. But that, historic preservation at its finest, right? So there are these sorts of really old illustrations of Serpent Mound are kind of critical because there's so few of them before things sort of changed over time. When Harvard came in, they made a bunch of changes at Serpent Mound, and then over the next century or so, after the Ohio Historical Society acquired it, they made changes at the site. So it's always good to go back to those original documents. And here's another one. This is really the one that has some of the actual, measurements that were done. And this is, again, another sort of sketch that's in the field notebook. So, again, these are amongst the earliest sketch drawings of Serpent Mound that are known to exist.
It's actually kind of fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, at least I think so. All right, so one of the other things that I should mention is that there was a guy that was at Serpent Mound before Squier and Davis, and he actually was the first guy to excavate into that stone altar in 1832, and his name was William Pidgeon, and he wrote a book called Traditions of Deku Da. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time about that, but what I will say is that he gave his manuscript to the Smithsonian after Squier and Davis had their manuscript published, and the Smithsonian agreed to publish his manuscript, but in kind of a weird kind of quirk that William Pidgeon had, he wrote the entirety of the manuscript in dactylic hexameter, which is like the same verse as the Iliad or the Odyssey, okay? And, his whole entire book was written that way, not exactly scientific prose. And so they assigned a guy from the Smithsonian to prepare it for publication. And that guy worked on it for several months. His name was Dr. Wills DeHaas. And then DeHaas got a political appointment to go and be the American consul down in the Yucatan. And so he jumped at the chance to go down and look at Mayan sites. And he gave up on the project. And he basically told the Smithsonian, look, I can't put this book together. This is like, and he actually wrote this specific criticism about William Pidgeon's manuscript. So William Pidgeon was an itinerant trader in the 1820s and 1830s, and he traveled all up and down North and South America trading all over the place. And he spent from about late 1820s into the 1840s in Wisconsin and Iowa and Nebraska and kind of up Minnesota, up in that area, before any of those places were states, okay? And while he was up in Wisconsin, before Wisconsin became a state, he met a Native American person that is named in the book called Deku Da. And so the title of the book, Traditions of Deku Da, is William Pigeon talking with this Native American about, hey, I've been visiting all these mounds and earthworks all over the Midwest. He came to Ohio and visited a bunch. What do they mean? What are these things? And so Deku Da explains to him what the meaning of all of these mounds and earthworks are. And Willis DeHaas was kind of in the paradigm of his day of, hey, the Indians didn't have anything to do with building these mounds. It were the mound builders. And so Deku Da may know a lot about his, what he called his red brethren, but he doesn't know anything about who built these mounds. And so we're not going to listen to the Native American guy. We're going to reject the manuscript. And that was his, rationale for rejecting the manuscript. Now, that manuscript, ever since that happened, has been rejected by the archaeological community. But it was published. It was published by a New York publisher, a guy by the name of Horace Thayer. And Horace Thayer did his own engravings of William Pigeon's drawings, which were pretty cheap and pretty chintzy compared to what the Smithsonian had done. The Smithsonian spent the equivalent of over $100,000 to produce all those lithographs for Squire and Davis's book. Well, Horace Thayer just, did his own little wood engravings and printed these very, very rudimentary drawings in Traditions of Deku Da. And so as a result of that, the archaeological community has condemned William Pigeon and his work as not being, map quality. They're not worthy of spending any time on, and they have labeled him a fraud and all kinds of nasty things that they've said about him over the years. It's really only in the last 5 to 10 years that the archaeological community has moved away from rejecting Native American oral traditions and have started to embrace it and bring it into the field of archaeology. And so maybe William Pigeon will get his due one of these days. But he actually excavated at Serpent Mound, the first guy known to do so. One of the things that happened was when he gave his manuscript to the Smithsonian, the Smithsonian let Squire take a look at it. And so Squire wrote a book in 1851 called The Serpent Symbol, and this is one of his copied drawings from William Pigeon's manuscript. Squire's book came out before William Pigeon's book did, and he used several of these serpent drawings that William Pigeon had in his book. Here's a couple more that he had drawn, and he used all of it in his book on the serpent symbol. And he credits William Pigeon, for this stuff. These illustrations are of serpent mounds that are today in Nebraska. They were identified as being in the Iowa Territory back then by William Pigeon. When he visited them, it was Iowa Territory, but they're now in Nebraska. And they're also, I think I have the other half of this, yeah. So these are some stone effigy serpents that were found in places like Iowa and Wisconsin. And so William Pigeon identified, hey, the serpent mound in Ohio is not the only serpent mound. There are these other serpent mounds. He's the first one to do that too. And so William Pigeon, talks to Deku Da about all of these. Well, these drawings, which were copied by Squire from William Pigeon's manuscript, are really the only record that we have of the sophistication of the drawings that William Pigeon may have had in his original manuscript. And, that got dispensed with, making really very poor quality ones, So let's talk a little bit about Squire. I kind of name him as the principal author of Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley because he wrote all the words in the book. Like Davis didn't write a single word that was in the book. And so he's sort of the principal author, but much of the second half of the book is of all of the artifacts that they were finding in the mounds. And Davis was the one that kind of assembled them, pieced them together, sorted them out, started to create scientific categories of different kinds of artifacts. And the second half of Ancient Monuments is all about that work, which was all about Davis. Davis did all that work. And of course, Davis paid for all the excavations that they worked on. And so everything, all the sort of bare knowledge that went into creating the book was sponsored by Davis, worked on by Davis, but Squire wrote the entirety of the manuscript on his own and also tried to get it published on his own with only him as the author. And they printed a sort of early version of it, which was called The Observations on the Aboriginal Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. That was published by the American Ethnological Society in 1847. And that caused a big commotion because he doesn't credit Davis as the author of the manuscript. He also took a lot of material from other people and doesn't credit any of them. One guy in particular, a guy by the name of James McBride, who did most of his excavating in northern Hamilton and Butler counties. He had been excavating in the United States, in Ohio, starting in the early 1820s. And so he was still working in the 1840s when Squire and Davis got together. In fact, Davis was a friend of McBride's. And Squire used one of his surveys of an earthwork that McBride had surveyed. And when that got published, one of McBride's co-surveyors wrote a scathing letter to one of the Cincinnati newspapers saying, Squire is stealing the work of James McBride and probably lots of other people. And that letter got to the Smithsonian. And the Smithsonian said and told Squire, you must add Davis's name to this manuscript. It's like a lot of this work is Davis's. So they added that. They also, Squire promised McBride that his name would also be on the title page, and it was omitted. And so while McBride is credited in Ancient Monuments, he isn't credited as a co-author. Now, let me give you some idea of how much did McBride contribute versus what Squire and Davis contributed. Well, if you just went by the published surveys that are in the book, McBride and his co-surveyors surveyed 41% of all of the surveys that are in the book. Squire and Davis, 28%. Okay. So there would be no book, there would be no Ancient Monuments book if it wasn't for McBride. Many of the earthwork surveys that were outside the state of Ohio were done by McBride and his co-surveyors. And so most of that work in the rest of the Mississippi Valley outside of Ohio would have not been in there had it not been for McBride. And so, that's a pretty damning indictment. Another one of the major contributors, a guy, a geologist by the name of Charles Whittlesley, he contributed like 19% of the surveys in the book. And he was also friends with McBride, and he sent McBride a letter saying, you're getting ripped off by Squire. I just sent a letter to Squire saying, I'm not going to contribute any more of my surveys to you, and I'm going to go to the Smithsonian, and I want all my stuff pulled out of this book. And so McBride, in his very gentlemanly fashion, writes a letter to Squire saying, I am not impinging your honor. I know that you'll do the right thing. Well, history shows Squire didn't really do the right thing. But Squire did go on to write many, many, many other works on archaeology. He wrote a book on the ancient monuments of Kentucky, one on the Aboriginal monuments of Western New York, the archaeology of Nicaragua, I mentioned the Serpent Symbol book. He wrote kind of a series that got published in Harper's Magazine and dozens of others. All right. So he went on to have sort of a famous archaeological career, although he didn't really work as a traditional archaeologist, you would say. He got involved he got a political appointment, much like De Haas got a political appointment, and he got sent to Central America to try to search for a transportation corridor that would take you through to the Pacific from the Gulf of Mexico. And he ended up getting hired by a company that was working on trying to put together a railway that would go across. This was long before the Panama Canal. And so Squire worked in these various countries to get transportation agreements to travel across the Isthmus of Panama. And so he was in Nicaragua, he was in Honduras. He was, kind of searching out a way to do all that. And that led to sort of eventually, bad times for Squire in the long run. But that you can read all about that in the book. It's in the end. So we'll talk a little bit about Hamilton Davis, his co-author. The only other real substantial archaeological work that Davis did was he wrote this manuscript called Sketches of the Monuments and Antiquities Found in the Mounds, Tombs, and Ancient Cities of America. That was prepared in 1858. He sent that to the Smithsonian for publication, and they never published it. So what I did was I published all of the material that's related to ancient monuments and all of his color illustrations that he had done for this manuscript. So that's in my book. You can read most of his manuscript, or at least all of the, you can see all of the illustrations that he had done. He had hired a kind of a painter who painted all these elaborate drawings. You can see here near photographic reproductions of many of the pipes and the artifacts. All of those are reproduced in my book. Many of them were not published in Ancient Monuments. Some were published in Ancient Monuments, but not all of them. And so I put all of that in the book. Now you may want to ask the question, where are those artifacts today? Well, Davis kind of ran into some financial trouble just kind of in the advent to the Civil War. Both he and Squire, after the publication of Ancient Monuments, both of them left Chillicothe and they moved to New York City. And Davis went to establish the Medical College of New York, and he taught there. He worked on all kinds of medical publications. He was developing different kinds of surgical techniques and so on and so forth. But the medical college was largely full of students from wealthy southern plantation landowners. And when the state started to leave at the advent of the Civil War, all of those students at the Medical College of New York went home. And so the medical college essentially collapsed financially. And so Davis resigned. And then he when the Civil War happened, he kind of ran into some financial trouble. And so he searched around to try to find somebody to purchase the collection in its entirety. And there were no takers in the United States. No one had any interest in it. The Smithsonian, you would think, would be a natural to maybe jump in and buy it, but during the Civil War, the Smithsonian's museum building was 1.5 miles from the southern warfront in Virginia, and was being occupied by the U.S. military as a scouting location, and they were thinking about using it for a hospital and all kinds of stuff. And so they also were not getting their annual money from Congress because half the Congress left, and it was unclear who was going to be able to run. How could we pass bills with all these senators and House members that weren't in the United States any longer? How do we work all this? And so they were trying to really save their money and not blow what little money they had. And so they didn't buy Davis's collection. But also there was some cloud around the collection itself, because during the 1840s, Ohio had a law in its books that it was illegal for people to disturb any graves, Native American or otherwise, and that if you were caught doing so, that was 30 days in jail, and you were to be fed only bread and water. That was the penalty, and you could be fined up to $10,000. And that also applied to, that law applied to anyone who knew about the digging into the mounds or helped facilitate it in any way. And so places like the American Ethnological Society and Harvard University and the American Antiquarian Society, who had helped Squire and Davis along the way, they knew about what Squire and Davis were doing. They are all sort of on the hook, for the sort of stolen goods of digging up all these graves, right? And so that cloud of suspicion over it may have also contributed to why nobody wanted to touch the collection, because there was this maybe legal matter hanging over it. So in any event, they found a buyer in England, a guy by the name of William Blackmore, who was kind of a wealthy industrialist, and he bought the collection and moved it to England. He actually built a museum just for it in Wiltshire, England, is where the museum was located. He and Squire later in the 1870s visited Serpent Mound with the intention of buying Serpent Mound to preserve it. They sort of failed. The landowner at the time rejected the offer from William Blackmore. Blackmore then went on a trip on the famous Hayden expedition to what became known as Yellowstone Park. And along that trip, he was hired to be the ethnologist on the trip because he had a real interest in Native American stuff. But he and his wife went on the trip, and his wife died on the way. And they named a mountain after her. Mount Blackmore in Montana is named after his wife. She's buried in Bozeman, Montana. So when Blackmore returned from that trip, went back to England, and then in 1873, there was a worldwide economic collapse. It started with what was known as the Panic of 1873, which led into something called the Great Depression. That's what they called it. Historians today call it the Long Depression versus the Great Depression of the 1930s. And during that depression, Blackmore's financial empire kind of crumbled, and he started drinking pretty heavily, and then he committed suicide. So, he didn't last long. Squire, he went and got married to one of the daughters of the company that he worked for, and when the company went south, collapsed, and went bankrupt at the beginning of the Civil War, he went to work for a publisher, and he edited this guy's magazine for a long time. Well, the publisher ran into some marital problems, and so he moved in with Squire and his wife. And so I don't know what it's like to have your boss live in the house with you. But at one point, the three of them decided they were going to go to the Paris Exposition. And so they took a steamship across the Atlantic, and they were coming into port in England. They were coming into Liverpool, and somebody on board the ship radioed ahead and notified the authorities, because that company that folded, it was called the Interoceanic Railway Corporation or something like that, the Honduras Interoceanic Railway Corporation. Squire was a named director of that corporation. When they went bankrupt, they owed a lot of money to a bunch of people overseas. And so Squire was arrested when they arrived. He got thrown into debtor's prison for a few weeks. And his wife and his boss went off to Paris. And when they got back, she divorced Squire and went and married the boss. And about a month after she married the boss, Squire's half-brother petitioned the courts in New York City to do a mental evaluation of Squire, and he got put in an insane asylum at the age of 53. So none of these people have survived too well. You know, bad karma runs around, I guess.
Shouldn't dig in those things.
Yeah. The other sort of major figure that we should talk about is the editor of the Smithsonian and the secretary of the Smithsonian, Joseph Henry. He was actually a true scientist. He worked on experiments in electricity and magnetism. He invented the first electric motor in the world. And he became the Smithsonian's secretary until he died in 1878. When he died, they commissioned a statue to be put out in front of the Smithsonian's building. There's the Smithsonian Castle building, they call it. And this is the statue of him that sits out in front of that. For the unveiling of the statue, they actually commissioned the famous composer John Philip Sousa to write a march. So if you want to go and listen to the Venus March, you can find that on YouTube. You can hear that march for the dedication of the statue to Joseph Henry. Now, why is he so important? Well, his goal was to create scientific publications, and he wanted to create a peer review process. And he did some heavy editing in that book, where he removed a lot of speculation and opinion, which wound up in later Squire publications like The Serpent Symbol. He pulled a lot of material out. So when I say, well, Squire only wrote 5 paragraphs about Serpent Mound that made it in Ancient Monuments, that's true, but he wrote a lot more about it, which ended up in his Serpent Symbol book, which was published a couple years after. So he was kind of in charge of all of that stuff at the time, and the book wouldn't be nearly as scientific as it is if it wasn't for Joseph Henry. So he played an important role in that.
The Smithsonian building looks so much like Music Hall in Cincinnati.
It does, doesn't it? So let's talk a little bit about some more contributors to the book. I mentioned James McBride, and I mentioned Colonel Charles Whittlesley. A few other people here of note. Dr. Samuel Hildreth was a medical physician in Marietta, Ohio, and he did a lot of work on mapping out earthworks in the Marietta area as well as in the plains out in Athens, Ohio. So there's some material attributed to him for that. Dr. John Locke from Cincinnati, he taught at one of the medical colleges in Cincinnati. He did a survey of Fort Hill in Highland County, and he is credited as doing the survey for Fort Ancient, but that's erroneous. He didn't do that, and I'll show you that here in a minute. Constantine Rafinesque down in Kentucky had already died like 4 or 5 years before Squire ever even thought of moving to Ohio, but Squire became friends with a guy by the name of Brantz Mayer, who was the founder of the Maryland Historical Society over in Baltimore. And Brantz Mayer had been a friend of Rafinesque's and had acquired most of Rafinesque's archaeological papers. And so Squire asked if he could borrow it, and he loaned him all of those papers. Well, Squire used just about every bit of it in Ancient Monuments, and so 8 to 9% of all the surveys in Ancient Monuments are done by Rafinesque. General William Lytle, here of the county fame, he did just one, well, I guess you could call it 2 surveys that are in Ancient Monuments. And I'll talk about those, the Milford Earthworks and the East Fork Works. Anybody ever hear of Captain Francis Cleveland? He was in charge of engineering the Ohio to Erie Canal from Chillicothe down to Portsmouth. And he lived down in Portsmouth, and he created the earliest known map of all of the Portsmouth earthworks in the late 1820s. And there's a map that was published, I think it was like 1830, 31-ish, that shows those earthworks on his map, and it shows the canal where in the locks on the canal. He, by the time that Squire finally arrived in the 1840s in Chillicothe, he had left that profession and he owned the newspaper in Portsmouth. And so when Squire came down to Portsmouth, he visited with Francis Cleveland and a couple of other people in Portsmouth. And scooped up all of their information, and he included that in the creation of his maps of the Portsmouth earthworks and never credited Francis Cleveland's work. But while I was looking through Squier's papers at the Library of Congress, I found Francis Cleveland's original survey maps. And so I put those in the book. Francis Cleveland had an assistant by the name of I.A. Lapham. I.A. Lapham went to Wisconsin, and he put together a whole manuscript on all the mounds and earthworks of Wisconsin, which was published by the Smithsonian in volume 7 of their Contributions to Knowledge, several after the first volume, which was done by Squire and Davis. And it's believed that I.A. Lapham was the guy who actually drafted out the map that Francis Cleveland did all the survey measurements for. So Francis Cleveland and I.A. Lapham contributed material to the book as well. And then you have Caleb Atwater, who had done his own sort of early version of Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. That was published by the American Antiquarian Society in 1819. It had 10 sites identified. Out of the 10 sites, 9 of them are in ancient monuments. None are credited to Caleb Atwater and his group of surveyors. Caleb Atwater was still alive in Circleville when Squire and Davis began their project, but Atwater famously had gotten political appointments by the Jackson administration, Democrats. Squire was a Whig, and when he started, he trained as a civil engineer. But because Jackson had dissolved the Bank of the United States and put the whole country into a massive depression, there were no civil engineering projects to be done. Nobody was spending any money on civil engineering projects, and so he went into the newspaper business as an alternative. And so he hated Democrats, and so he hated Caleb Atwater. And so he used Caleb Atwater's survey of the Circleville earthworks in ancient monuments. You can lay Atwater's directly over the one in ancient monuments. They're a virtual match. And he does not mention Caleb Atwater by name. He dances around identifying him by name. It just doesn't want to talk about him. Now, a couple of these people up at the top row, these 3 that I boxed in green, Whittlesley, Hildreth, and John Locke, as well as I.A. Lapham, put together in the 1830s a committee that eventually wound up as a legislative initiative that was known as the Geological Survey of Ohio. And these guys were sent out to create a geological survey map in the state of Ohio. The very first survey map that was published was by Dr. John Locke of the geology of Adams County, Ohio. And it was a color survey map that was published in 1837 in the first volume. They published 2 volumes. In the first volume, Charles Whittlesley identifies that part of their mission was not just to do geological surveying, but anywhere they found earthworks, they were to survey those too. And so by the time that they rolled around to volume 2, Whittlesley identified that they had surveys of at least 60 different earthwork sites in Ohio, which is why Squire goes to Charles Whittlesley to borrow all of those surveys to put in his book. Now, Whittlesley was friends with Davis. Davis actually assisted Charles Whittlesley on the survey of the Newark earthworks. Right out of college, when Davis got out of medical college, he went and helped Whittlesley survey the Newark earthworks. So these guys all were part of that. And so when Squire used all of that material, or at least a big chunk of that material in Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, he does not credit the Ohio Geological Survey as being responsible for creating many of these surveys of mounds and earthworks. And he doesn't credit the taxpayers of the state of Ohio who paid for any of that material. He also goes on to use material from county surveyors, local surveyors, like, village surveyors and city surveyors, as well as state surveyors. He also used some federal surveys that were done of mounds and earthworks up in Wisconsin, some effigy mounds that wound up in the book. So really, the book is in large part a product of taxpayer funding at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. And none of that is identified in Ancient Monuments in any way, shape, or form. That the taxpayers paid for a big chunk of a lot of these surveys to be done, right? So I always try to credit the taxpayers for helping put this book together, because they certainly contributed with their funding. So there's that survey from the Ohio Geological Survey of the Adams County geology. I mentioned lithography, so I figured I would show an example of what we're talking about to produce these lithographs. This is a stone plate that is, the illustration is done in mirror reverse. This is I found this online. This is a lithograph map of Munich, Germany. And then when you apply the ink and you stamp it, then you get the actual print. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about engraving on stone and then putting that ink on and stamping it. Now, the two guys that are most responsible for all of the major illustrations in Ancient Monuments, one is this guy, Napoleon Cerrone, quite a character. The other guy, Henry Major, I've never found even an illustration of him anywhere. So, but the two of them got their training and their start at a famous lithographic company. How many people have heard of Currier and Ives?
Oh, yes.
So they got their start at Currier and Ives, making those nice little Christmas card prints or whatever. And then they struck out on their own, and they began their business at the start of the Mexican-American War. And they became famous for creating lithographic prints like this one of the storming of Chapultepec, which is sort of one of the key battles in the Mexican-American War. Pictured in this group down here are, I think, 6 different presidents, future presidents of the United States that participated in the battle, and other famous generals, that are in there. So they became famous for this, and because of the fame during the war, which was, during the same period of time that Squire and Davis were doing their work, when it came time to publishing that, the Smithsonian hired Cerrone and Major to do all of those lithographs that are in Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. Out of the 48 lithographic plates, they produced, I think, 45 of them. And there are also 200 woodcut illustrations in the book. So what does it look like to be a woodcutter? Well, these are the 2 woodcutters that did 200 of the illustrations in Ancient Monuments. This is Nathaniel Orr and James Richardson. And I think if you walked on the street and saw one of these guys, I couldn't tell the difference between them. That must have been the style of facial hair back in the day. But I did track down Nathaniel Orr's original business logo. So there it is over there in mirror reverse. And when you stamp it out, that's what you get. So that's the kind of work that Nathaniel Orr did. Much of his work and letters and correspondence and stuff is preserved, oddly, at the University of Florida, which is where this is down in the University of Florida. So those 2 guys did quite a bit of work for the book. I mentioned some of the sources and places where I received material or found material. So when I started this project, it was during the pandemic, and all of the major institutions were shut down. But I had been corresponding with one of the curators at the Library of Congress, where they had a collection of Squire's papers. And he said, well, yeah, sorry, the archives are all closed. You can't do it. And I said, okay. And he said, well, back in 1971, the Congressional Photo Duplication Service photographed that collection, and we can send you the film strips through interlibrary loan. And so I couldn't take them out of the Peebles Library, but they sent them to the Peebles Library. The problem was none of the libraries in Adams County had a machine that could read the film. But fortunately, my mother-in-law was part of the Adams County Genealogical Society back in the 90s and early 2000s. And when they went to throw out their film reader machine, she saved it. And so we hunted it down in her house and dusted it off and plugged it in, and the light bulb still worked. And so I was able to take that down. It's like the size of a 1980s video game machine. It's like this big giant wooden thing, and you put the film in and it projects it down onto a surface so you can read that material. And so we lugged that down and set it in the library for a couple of weeks, and every day I'd go down there and I would go through this. Now they had 14 rolls of film with over 10 to 12,000 documents on these rolls of film. So many of the illustrations kind of overlay each other and all this kind of stuff. And I went through all of that material, and on roll number 12 is where I found the material relating to ancient monuments in the Mississippi Valley, all those original drawings and illustrations. So it was a lot of eye-bleeding work, And so just to understand what we're talking about here, these are on 35 millimeter film strips, which gives you an effective size of 24 millimeters or less than 1 inch by 1.4 inches, 36 millimeters in width. So if we were to give you some sense of what that looks like, they would put 2 sheets of these papers into that, and that's what I had to look at, okay? Now, I had a slide scanner, a digital slide scanner, so I was able to feed that film whenever I could find something that I wanted to scan. I had to feed it in. And so you're talking about something that's pretty small. Normally, if you want to publish something in the publishing world, you had to have at least 600 dots per inch. But these illustrations are so small, I had to scan these at 19,500 dots per inch to get it to blow up to a size that we could look at, all right? And that's what my book contains, is all of these scanned original illustrations from the Library of Congress. So that's the first sort of source. I mentioned going up to the Chicago Field Museum. This is a picture of Squire's original field notebooks. And so he went through all that original source material. So there's lots of sources. They also had Charles Whittlesey's papers in their collection. So I went through Charles Whittlesey's papers as well. And some of that material is wound up in my book. So let's look at some in particular, show a couple of examples of what we're talking about here. So this is a plate from Ancient Monuments that shows the Dunlap works from Ross County over here. And this is the Athens County earthworks. This is in the plains. This is the one that was done by Samuel Hildreth. He's the credited surveyor. I'm not going to talk about that one. I'm just going to talk about the one, the Dunlap works on the other side. So remember what I said about lithographers not being Xerox machines and copying from the original illustrations. So I found Squire's original survey of the Dunlap works, and I'll pull it up for comparison here. Now, you'll notice that at the Dunlap works here, this sort of polygon here is kind of slanted down this way. But what do you see over here? It's slanted up this way. That's a significant difference. If you're an archaeologist and you're going out in the field and you're trying to relocate this thing, you're trying to find this embankment, you're walking in the wrong place. These things are, this is a 15-acre area, all right? So, you could be off hundreds of feet from where you should be looking if you're an archaeologist. And there are other differences. this doesn't exactly match that. There's a lot of stuff here, but this is what we're talking about, why it's so critical to go back to these original source documents. So let's talk about the Milford works and the East Fork works, because they appear in Squire and Davis's book. And they mention it. They say about 20 miles above these remains, above the East Fork of the Little Miami, is a singular work. He's here talking about this part of it. And he says that it appears in Dupay's work and in the appendix to Hugh Williamson's work on the climate of America. And so he's using source material to create these illustrations. Squire and Davis did not visit the Milford works or the East Fork works. They're relying on already published source information. Okay. Yeah, you can. Yeah, this is straight out of Ancient Monuments. That's the plate. And up on top, this top piece and this piece over here is part of the Milford works. This is the East Fork works, which is about 5 miles above Williamsburg. All right. So these were on both sides of the river going through Milford. This is on the north side, kind of up in the Indian Hill area, going up into that area. And this is is completely occupied by the city of Milford today. I'm sure that at some point you'll get a presentation from Sean Chaney about his work and documenting what remains of it. There may be a bit or two left, but most of it's destroyed. But I want to talk about what they say, what Squire and Davis say about their sources. So they mention this guy Dupay, and they mention Williamson, and that they said it was surveyed by General Lytle. Okay, so those are the three sources that they name. So we'll take a look at those three sources. The Dupay part of it, they spelled that wrong, and they spelled the guy who did it Warden with an O. There was no Warden. It was a guy by the name of David Bailey Warden with an A. And there's a little illustration of him in the top corner. He was born in 1778 and he died in 1845, so before Squire and Davis got started. He, at one point, he had served, or I don't know if you want to say served, but he fought in the Irish Revolution. And when the revolution failed, he fled to the United States. And he became a kind of a tutor to a senator's son, and that guy got politically appointed to be the ambassador to France. When he went to France, he took Warden with him, and eventually Warden did so well over there, he became the ambassador to France, and so he spent much of the rest of his life over in Paris, and he did a lot of work with historical societies and the geographic societies over in France. But one of the things that the Geographic Society did over there was they sponsored a contest they wanted to have more information about the ancient remains in North America. Because for decades, Mexico was very, very tightly controlled by Spain. They did not allow foreigners really into the country. And so not a lot of information was coming out about the ancient remains in Mexico and in Central America. And then when the Mexican Revolution happened in the 1820s, it kind of opened up. And one of the manuscripts that came out of Mexico was this manuscript that became titled the Antiquities Mexicanes, Relation des Trois Expeditions du Capitaine Dupay. Captain Dupay had gone into Mexico. He was like some soldier for hire, and he wound up bringing some artists on his team as they went around through Mexico. They did a lot of drawings of a lot of ancient sites in Mexico. And that manuscript wound up getting published in France. And when it got published in France in the 1830s, David Bailey Worden put in an appendix. And in the appendix, he included this illustration of the Milford works and the East Fork works. And this illustration is much more detailed than what appears in Squire and Davis's. In fact, Squire and Davis sort of split this into two pieces, right? This is one plate and this is a different plate. And, so they've kind of taken it out of its context. And so you can see what David Bailey Worden had produced. So this was published in 1834, and this is the Dupay source that Squire and Davis mentioned, okay? So you have to understand where that kind of came from. But David Bailey Worden had already published this before, because he had published this version of it this is this one is called The Ancient Fortifications sur les bords du Petit Miami et de ses affluents. This, again, talking about who the lithographer was, a very famous lithographic firm in Paris was the Thiers-Ferries in Paris. They did this lithograph. And you may be wondering, well, how did Worden get surveys? Where did he come up with the survey? Well, he had reached out to the Army engineers in Washington, D.C., and asked them for drawings of mounds and earthworks that they had in their possession. And so they sent him several. So this is just one of a collection of several that he republished. The person who fulfilled his request was a guy by the name of Major Isaac Roberdeau. And Roberdeau was sort of fulfilling the request by David Bailey Worden. The documents already existed. They were already there. He did not create a new map or anything like that. These were just already in the possession of the Army. And so he sent them over to him. He also published this one. This is the earliest one that he published. This is in 1827. And the translation of this is Sketch of Ancient Fortifications on the Banks of the Little Miami and its tributaries in the state of Ohio. And so Worden had, again, this is a collection of earthwork maps. Several of them were adapted from Caleb Atwater's publication. So you have sort of redos of those, but you also have this one included. Now, back in 1996, there was an economics professor at Ohio State University by the name of J. Huston McCullough. And he wrote this very, very controversial article that was published in a magazine called Ancient American, where he identified this East Fork works as a Jewish menorah. And that's the earliest identification that this has anything to do with Jewish people, which is kind of a ludicrous thing. So it's not until 1996 that story gets published. Nobody before 1996 ever identified it as being anything other than an ancient earthwork here in the United States. But McCullough went to the Army, and in the National Archives, he found the original map. And he published the original map, and so I got this from McCullough. And so this is the original source that was used by David Bailey Worden and the Thiers-Ferries lithographic firm to create those lithographs, which were published in France, right? So this is the original one. Now, what's interesting about this is you may be able to see a seam here. According to McCullough, who examined the map in person, these were sort of stitched together. And so that's why they always appear together in all of the earliest published accounts, because they've been stitched together in this earliest map survey, all right? And this is the one that that Isaac Roberdeau sent to David Bailey Warden. Okay, he sent a copy of this original survey, but McCullough and I have discussed this now after, when I was publishing my book, I reached out to him and said, look, you mistranslated some stuff in your article, and I think you got some of these details wrong, and this is what I'm going to publish. I want you to know that you're going to get called out on this. And he wrote me back, and we talked on the phone, and he says, you're right. You're right. And so what we believe is that this is the Lytle survey. This is Lytle's original survey, because he sent that to the federal government, and that got put into their archives. So when William Lytle did his original survey, he did this as a survey, and he did this as a survey, and then he stitched them together, and they were in the possession of the Army topographical unit when in the 1820s, almost 20 years after Lytle did his survey, that it winds up getting sent to France and being published in France. Right? Now, for those that may have attended my talk last April, I talked about hunting down some of the original correspondence regarding how did this get to Washington in the first place. And I talked about Senator John Brown in Kentucky, and I found correspondence between Brown and William Lytle, and discussing the earthwork survey, so I won't go into all of that. But this wound up first going to the Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, and that's where David Bailey Warden was a member. Before he got sent to France, he was a member of the Philosophical Society, and so he had seen it. He had known about it. That's why he asked the Army for a copy of it so that they could publish it in the 1820s. So that's how these people are connected. Roberdeau was just sort of the secretary fulfilling the request. And this is a picture of Isaac Roberdeau, by the way. He died in 1829, but the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers is what he was in charge of. Now, Squire and Davis also mentioned this other source, which is actually older, and that is by Hugh Williamson. It was published, again, in an appendix in his book, at the very end of his book. The book has a super long title, and I want to read this off so people understand what this book was largely about. Observations on the climate in different parts of America compared with the climate in corresponding parts of the other continent, to which are added remarks on the different complexions of the human race, with some account of the Aborigines in America being an introductory discourse to the history of North Carolina. Okay, that's the title of his book. And in an appendix in that book, he published this. These are on 2 pages. You have the Milford Works here, and you have the East Fork Works. And again, they're together. They're tied together. Why are they tied together? Because they've been stitched together on the original map survey. And that's why you always see these 2 earthworks together in all these original sources. All right, so if you were to compare all of those early original ones, Hugh Williamson, 1811, David Bailey Warden, 1823, David Bailey Warden, 1834, Squire and Davis, 1848. This is the original map from William Lytle. They look fairly similar to one another with minor details. Why do you have difference of details? Because it goes back to who's the engraver? Who's the guy doing the woodcut or the lithograph, right? How did they recopy it? Well, back in 1811, if you go back to this period of time and you look at illustrations that are printed in books, they're usually done as woodcuts, and they're usually in this really angular, very thick line sort of thing. And that's what their woodcut artists decided to copy, was that. When you get to David Bailey Warden, he's having one of the premier lithographic companies in the world did his lithograph, and so they come out looking much closer to the original, right? And again, David Bailey Warden, this is another publication. So again, it still looks fairly similar, but you get this really thick block line because a different artist created that. So that's somewhat similar to this one. And then by the time you get to Squire and Davis, you have Cerrone and Major doing their copy, but they're copying directly from Dupay, which is this one. So they basically, Squire provided the lithographers with a copy of this, which is why you get that. All right, and they made changes. They all made changes. All these artists made changes. It's not like a Xerox, right? So that's why you have these differences in these early surveys. But all of these surveys, Williamson and Warden and Squire and Davis, they all trace back to the one survey that was done by the original survey that was done by William Lytle, like around 1803. We don't know the exact date. I have correspondence of letters that talk about him going and visiting this earthwork, but so we can kind of narrow the date down, but we don't have an exact date of when he made it. Right? And there's no dating on the actual map itself. So that gives you some sense. And I wrote about all of these details and stuff in my book if you want to, go find all that stuff out together. So I just put in some guidelines here so you can see how similar they all are. So let's talk a little bit about some of the recently recognized UNESCO World Heritage Sites here in Ohio. Squire and Davis, visited many of them, and many of the surveys of those earthworks appear in Ancient Monuments. So let's take a look at a few of those. Let's start with Fort Ancient. I mentioned that the Fort Ancient illustration in Ancient Monuments is credited to Dr. John Locke from Cincinnati. That is not the case. John Locke did do a survey of Fort Ancient, but I'll show you what that looks like here. I've rotated it for comparison. So this is Locke's version versus the version that appears in Ancient Monuments. And there's some similarities to them and some differences to them. But I don't think I have this illustration in here, but amongst the papers of why am I blanking on his name? Let me go back real quick here and look at this. It'll trigger my memory here. James McBride, sorry. So in the papers of James McBride, which Squire borrowed all of James McBride's papers to produce a number of them, there is a virtual exact copy of this. And the only difference between the one that McBride did his survey of and the one that appears in Ancient Monuments is you see how this is curved? On McBride's, it's straight. That's the only difference. Everything else is virtually identical. And so McBride is the one that did the survey, not John Locke, but it's credited to John Locke in the book. Just to give you an example of some of the earlier source material, this is the illustration that appears in Caleb Atwater's book, all right, which dates back to 1819. And so when I was doing my research for my book, I reached out to the American Antiquarian Society in Massachusetts because they're the ones that originally published Caleb Atwater's material. And I said, hey, do you have any of the original source material for that book? And they searched through their archives and they found 5 of the original 10 surveys. Okay, and so for the very first time, none of them have ever been published before. In fact, none of them have ever been cited before by anybody. I hunted down the original source for this and published it, and this is what it looks like. There is a lot of cursive drawing, which I transcribed in my book. By the way, this is also in color, and this is from 1807. And this survey was done by a county surveyor up in Warren County, Ohio. And as Caleb Atwater had written to the American Antiquarian Society, he almost didn't get this survey because The courier who was taking it from the county surveyor to Atwater, from Warren County to Circleville, had to cross a river, and he lost his satchel in the river, and it floated down the river, and they found it down the river, and he managed to get it, and that's what they sent to the American Antiquarian Society. And they got that, and they used this to create a woodcut, which ended up being this. All right, so almost never made it into Atwater's publication. Now you may see that this section here, this other extension, is not quite in this, but it's down here as a supplementary plan. On the James McBride map, it's not included at all. It didn't even have this supplementary plan, so there were several other sources, but my guess is that this is one of those cases where Squire used Caleb Atwater's work and took that section and created the supplementary plan because it wasn't part of James McBride's survey. And so they added that down in the corner. It's not disjointed, it's actually part of the whole thing. Right? And so all these notes, by the way, that are on here are really interesting details. Probably the earliest written description that we know of anything about the Fort Ancient earthworks is on this map. And so I transcribed all that. A lot of really interesting details. Another earthwork that sort of gets misattributed here. This is the Newark earthworks, famous map from Ancient Monuments. And you'll notice down here that it's credited to Charles Whittlesley, E.G. Squire, and E.H. Davis, 1837 to 1847. Well, it didn't take them 10 years to survey this. In fact, Charles Whittlesley and Davis surveyed this for the Geological Survey back in 1838, and it took them 4 or 5 days, and they surveyed all of this out. Squire has inserted himself into this. He didn't have anything to do with this other than he redrew what Charles Whittlesley had done. All right, and so I want to show people what I mean by what do you mean he redrew it? Here is Squire's redrawing of it, okay? This is what he gave to the lithographers, okay? I'll show you what Charles Whittlesley did in a moment, but there are some differences between what Squire produced and gave to the lithographers and the lithographic print. If I go back to that lithographic print here, okay? So there are some differences between them. The lithographers kind of streamlined it a little bit, but there's some unusual sort of weird jagginess in some of these earthwork walls that we can kind of explain, because when we look at the actual one, which was done by Charles Whittlesley, by the way, Squire never sent the map back to Charles Whittlesley. He kept it in his collection, which is at the Library of Congress, and that's what this is. So this is the original survey that was done by Whittlesley and Davis, which then Squire redrew so that he could add his name to the credits. And so you have kind of a difference here. So this is one of the most accurate early maps that was ever done, and that's attributed to Whittlesley and Davis. And interestingly enough, I put all of these in the book. When I went through Whittlesley's papers up at the Western Reserve Historical Society, this is a huge area to cover. Anybody ever been to the Newark Earthworks? So this is, this earthwork here is huge by itself. This is huge by itself. So they're covering a pretty sizable area. They've also put in where the canal goes. So again, another extension of the Ohio Erie Canal that went through there, which kind of destroyed part of this earthwork. But each one of these little bits of sections of the earthwork, there's a separate survey of them. And so they went and surveyed every little section, little bit of it, and then, based on all of that accumulated stuff, then Whittlesley did the full survey based on that. So he kind of reconstructed it all. They didn't survey it all at one time. And so I put all of those little bits of the survey in in my book, so because none of that's ever been published before, too. Interestingly enough, this has never been published before until I published it, but it's not the earliest survey because there was a survey that was of the Newark earthworks that appeared in Caleb Atwater's book, and so this is that version from 1819. And this was one of the ones that the American Antiquarian Society had the original source map. So they sent me that, and I published that. That's also in color. And so this is the original source that Caleb Atwater got of the Newark earthworks. And this is one of the earliest maps that's ever been done of the Newark earthworks. And it just so happens it's in color. Like what? Are you kidding me? This is incredible stuff. And all these notes, I transcribed all of these references and notes. There's all kinds of notes that go with this. It's a pretty amazing document. And so you can read all the backstory about all that stuff in my book. Another point I want to call out here, this is the, how many people have been up to Mound City in Chillicothe? So this is part of what is known as the Hopewell Culture National Historic Park today. The 7 units that make up the park was part of the UNESCO World Heritage process. And so this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. This is, at least this half of it here, of this large earthen circle is now where the prison is in Chillicothe. And part of this side over here, they've now got a 4-lane road going through this. And so there was an archaeologist by the name of Dr. Jared Burks from Ohio Valley Archaeology that did a magnetometer survey of this. This earthwork's called the Shriver Circle. That's what it's been named by archaeologists. But he tried to do a magnetometer survey of this, and so he was able to survey this side fairly well because it's in kind of agricultural land owned by the prison. But he had to go inside the prison walls into the open areas to do the magnetometer survey to get some of the rest of this, which he did. And so he managed to do all of that. Now, one of the things I want to identify here is the artistic conventions that we have to look at so we can understand what we're viewing here. So we have an earthwork wall that surrounds this sort of rounded square of Mound City up here. And then you have an earthwork wall here, but you have this really dark line, right? What is the difference between this and this? Between one that has a dark line and one that doesn't have a dark line? Well, the dark line is actually identifying a ditch, okay? So that's the artistic convention of identifying a ditch versus an earthwork wall. The earthwork wall doesn't have any, hard colored in part. It's just the ditch. By the late 1840s, that was the artistic convention. And that was really part of the work that the artists did. When you look at these old maps, they're the ones that came up with the artistic conventions. And so when you look at ancient monuments, that is done by the work of the artists, creating that sort of visual lexicon of how to understand what these are representing. So like this little circle up here has a dark ditch on the inside, versus this one that's got the ditch on the outside, and this one that doesn't have a ditch at all, and this one that supposedly doesn't have a ditch at all. Now, the Mound City one, they show that there are all these sort of pit features on the outside. Some of those still exist today. When you go to Mound City, it's all reconstructed. It was, reconstructed twice over, once by the Ohio Historical Society and once by the National Park Service. It's literally been bulldozed over twice and rebuilt twice. But nevertheless, I'll show you another earthwork survey of that by, I found Davis's survey of Mound City. Not Squire's, but Davis's. And this is what Davis's look like. Well, I'm sure I got one more in between here. So this is what Squire did this is the source document that was used by others to create that. So, and you can see he kind of cut and pasted pieces together where he like made mistakes or whatever, and he redrew it, and then he pasted a piece on there and pasted a piece on there, pasted this on here. So that's what he was giving the artists, and then they create that over there. So this is what Squire drew, and you can see that he's just got this like really dark thing there. You know, it's hard to tell between the earthwork and where the ditch is on his drawing. But I want to show you what Davis. Oh, this is I got another early one. So this was an early sketch, one that Squire had done. This is an early one. You can see the difference between these. So this is an early draft that he did. And I should mention that when the artists started to work on this project for the Smithsonian, Squire was supplying them with full-page illustrations for every single earthwork. And they allocated a certain amount of money for the artists to create all these. And they blew through that original amount of money in a heartbeat. And so they had to go back to the Smithsonian Regents to get more money. And they allocated 5 times the amount of the original money, and they blew through all of that. And so they had to go back a third time and try to get more money. And they told Squire, look, your artist can't be doing these full-page illustrations anymore. You're going to have to consolidate. And so that's when they started putting multiple earthworks on a single plate, and which is why we end up with the way that the East Fork works and the Milford works is all cut up in bits and pieces, because they couldn't do a full one anymore. They were having to consolidate, and eventually they got to putting 6 on a plate. Because they were trying to cram it all in. And so this was actually, one of those ideas of consolidating 2 earthworks into one piece. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if we would have some time for some questions.
Sure. Yeah. No problem. I'm almost done here. I've just got a couple more. So this is Squire's original full-page illustration of just Mound City that didn't get published because he was forced to consolidate, right? And then here's what Davis had done. Now, I want to make this point because what do you see here with Mound City?
Ah, it's got a ditch.
It's got a ditch. Has anybody been to Mound City? Is there a ditch?
No.
Nope. There's no ditch. He shows a ditch on the inside all the way around. And this is very detailed. He's got very detailed drawings of all these earthworks and labels. And so when Mound City got reconstructed by the Ohio Historical Society in the 1920s, what did they use as their source material for reconstructing reconstructing Mound City?
One without a ditch.
The one without a ditch. And so did the National Park Service when they reconstructed it in the 1950s and 60s.
Oh my gosh.
So nobody had seen this drawing until I uncovered it in the Library of Congress, and published it in my book. So when you go to Mound City, just understand that it's an incomplete reconstruction. Right? They didn't quite get it right. So I'll just show a quick run through of a couple more of these UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So this is the famous Hopewell earthworks. Squire and Davis called it the North Fork Works, which is kind of a weird thing. It's on the North Fork of Paint Creek. Caleb Atwater did a survey of this, I'll show Squire. There's Squire's original source drawing that he gave to the lithographers. This is the drawing that appeared in Caleb Atwater's book, and this is also one of the ones that the American Antiquarian Society had the original source drawing for. So I'll show you what that looks like. Maybe. There it is. Oh, I put it on the cover of my book. So it's in color, but I put that on the cover of the book, and I think I have a kind of a larger version of it here, yeah, so you can see what it looks like. And so this was done by some surveyors that were living in Chillicothe. They were actually attached to the federal government's land office in Chillicothe. So this was done probably around like 1815 or so by a set of surveyors from that office, that land office. And they gave this to Atwater, and Atwater used it in his book. So that's one of the ones. Now I did find Squire's original sketch drawing of it when he did his survey, which I've rotated. It's kind of squished. It's really weird looking, but it crosses 2 pages of his notebook. And I did find what I think is the earliest survey that was done of that earthwork. I've rotated it upside down to kind of follow the convention of everybody else. But this was done by a guy by the name of Dr. Daniel Drake in Cincinnati. For those that remember my April talk from last year, I mentioned Daniel Drake was one of the people that wrote about the East Fork works and published that in 1815. Well, he went around and he did a whole bunch of earthwork surveys. Some of the earliest earthwork surveys that I've been able to identify. This dates to around 1807 or so. And I actually not only have all these notes, but there are also all of the actual survey measurements as a separate document. And so I have all of that, and I published that in the book. He also did the earliest survey of like Spruce Hill, for instance, which appears on this kind of larger map that Squire put together for ancient monuments of the Paint Creek Valley. This is the Sipe Mound earthworks, which is part of the UNESCO World Heritage group. This is the Baum earthworks. This is in private hands. This is the Spruce Hill earthworks, which is owned by the Ark of the Appalachia. This is the Bourneville earthworks. This is in private hands. And this earthwork was made out of stone, and this one appears to have been kind of destroyed and lost and down in the bottom here. This is on what's known as Black Run. So people have various names for it. Black Run earthworks is a common one. Now, Squire put this map together, and he credits himself constructed by E.G. Squire, 1847. That is not the same as surveying. Some of what he has in some of his maps is that he's the delineator. So he redrew the map that then got made by the artists. So he's always trying to give himself credit for something, and this is one that he constructed. But really, this was kind of a version that appeared in Caleb Atwater's document. Here's Squire's delineation of that he gave to the lithographers. This is the Caleb Atwater version. So you have the this is the Sipe Mound earthworks, the Baum earthworks, and the Spruce Hill earthworks, and they just have a letter E up here for the Bourneville earthworks, which is kind of interesting. Now, so Atwater had already gotten this. This was also one of the maps that the American Antiquarian Society had the original source document of, and so there was a group. I published this in the book, again in color, from about 1815, and so you have all this, and there are a lot of notes on here. Interestingly enough, the color is important. This mound right here is in red, okay? And Atwater writes about this mound being a mound completely made of red ochre, okay? And right here at the bend of Paint Creek, there is what's known as Little Copperas Mountain, and that is a source for getting that red ochre. And so they had a large mound of just red ochre. Now, why I point this out is Caleb Atwater was writing about this in 1819. The survey was done like 4 years before. By the late 1840s, when Squire goes to reconstruct his map and redo his map, he says that he went to the Sipe Mound earthworks, and this is not a mound made of red ochre. He disputes that, and he says that, no, it's not the case. Well, who do you want to believe? Like, this mound is long gone now, so we don't really know, but I would say that the people that investigated it the earliest and actually used the color to color the mound and wrote about the color of the mound might be more right than Squire, who shows up, a quarter century later, right? There's a lot of other interesting things about these early surveys that I talk about in the book, but that gives you some sense of it. I'll just go through a couple of other sections in the book so you can see. These are pictures of flint artifacts that were in Davis's manuscript that did not get published by the Smithsonian. Some of these artifacts appear in ancient monuments and as woodcut illustrations, and so I identify which ones are which. But would you rather see them in color so that you can identify them, or in the black and white that's in the Smithsonian's Ancient Monuments print? So there are all of these illustrations that Davis had hired a professional artist to create like photo, quality reproductions in color of all these things. So now we have some sense of the color of these. You have black obsidian artifacts, and you have, all these different kinds of artifacts. There were also groups of these animal effigy mounds, which Davis then went through and sorted through them all and identified. Here are all of the pipes that are quadrupeds. There are several sets of birds, for instance. And so you can now tell what the color of the pipestone was, that they were using. They identify, here's another group of birds. Here's another group of birds. Lots and lots of these effigy pipes. All of these were dug out of one mound at Mound City, mound number 8 at Mound City. And these are the pipes that are in the collection over in England. When the Wiltshire Museum closed in the 1930s, the collection was bought by the British Museum, so the British Museum has these now. So here's an interesting collection of stone tablets. Now, Davis owned these because these were dug out of a mound at the Hopewell Earthworks. And he owned probably this spool up in the corner, which is kind of a Fort Ancient era artifact. This is almost a virtual reproduction of a tablet that was found in a mound near the Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia. It wasn't found in the Grave Creek Mound, but near the Grave Creek Mound. And so they show this. And then this is the famous Cincinnati tablet, which was dug out of a mound in downtown Cincinnati off of Mound Street. And it's unclear. Davis, I don't think, ever owned this. The guy who owned the property kept it in his possession, but Davis clearly was familiar with it and had some drawings done of the front, the back, and the side of it. All right? So I talk about all these stone tablets in the book. And so that all comes from his manuscript called The Sketches of Monuments and Antiquities of the Mounds, Tombs, and Ancient Cities in America. So let's close with a little poem here. I think this one is kind of appropriate. I use this in my talk. So what are we talking about when we're talking about all these burial mounds and earthworks of ancient people, right? So is this the ground where generations lie, mourned by the drooping birch and dewy fern, and by the faithful alder-shaded burn which seems to breathe an everlasting sigh? No sign of habitation meets the eye, only some ancient furrows I discern, and verdant mounds, and from them sadly learn that hereabout men used to live and die. It's from Richard Wilton.
And women.
What's that?
And women.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. So I just want to point out it's men in the general sense. Many of the institutions that I want to thank that helped in my project: the American Antiquarian Society, the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, the Western Reserve Historical Society, Marietta College, University of Kentucky, the Gilder Leman Institute of American History, the Wisconsin Historical Society, the Special Collections Library at the University of Georgia, the St. Louis Art Museum, Harvard, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Hathi Trust, Penn Libraries at the University of Pennsylvania, Internet Archive, Google Books, all played a role to put this project together. So.
Would you go back